Today's hot takes starts with the hottest take of all, that Second Dinner might have done something right. SD got it right by nerfing Fenris Wolf. Not nerfing Mercury was proof that they know more than we often give them credit for. I think this is a reasonable take, but I will say I think that if you had to choose the group of Fenris Wolf, Mercury, Cannonball, I do think they nerfed the right too, but I don't think that's necessarily down to having the correct decision there, so much as it's down to it's a lot easier to nerf Fenris Wolf and Cannonball than it is to nerf Mercury without betraying what the card is about. People sort of forget that Fenris Wolf was supposed to be a tech card when it released, and that's why it was costed where it was, because it was kind of the only tech card you could reasonably run if you were trying to beat a Hella deck. And Stardust just came out, which means that Fenris Wolf is no longer carrying that weight alone, and it frankly wasn't very good at carrying that weight alone in the first place, so you can actually balance it more properly now for what it's actually used for, which is Negasonic, Shang-Chi, Cannonball, Mercury. Now, the other reason I think it's bad for them to have nerfed Mercury is because a lot of the suggestions for nerfing Mercury are things that I think would either do not enough or do too much. So with Mercury, let's say you take away her ability to move. If you take away her ability to move, she's not doing her actual job, which is to be an anti-move tech card. That's just not really a good card to put in your deck if you're trying to beat move. Even current Mercury, I would argue, is very overrated in terms of actually beating move. I know that sounds a little ridiculous, but I do think that the higher up you get, the more move is able to meaningfully play around a Mercury, even in her current state. We've seen good players like Sizer take these decks, move decks that are generally regarded as, oh, what are you talking about? A, that's not even all that good, and B, Mercury exists, to very high placements in the Golden Gauntlet, very high finishes on ladder. This kind of stuff genuinely is important to Mercury's card. And I think if you take that ability away, which a lot of people pitched, it would solve the Cannonball issue, but it would also make her not actually do her main job. And one of the things I look for when you look at nerfs like this is, does this solve the issue? Does this alleviate the issue? Maybe it doesn't perfectly solve it without obliterating the card's ability to perform its function. And with Fenris Wolf, it absolutely solves the issue without obliterating Fenris Wolf's function. Its function is exactly the same, it's just less efficient, so you won't play it as an efficient stat card. Its function was never supposed to be efficient stat card, though. And I think the same applies to Cannonball. It can still do what it used to do, but that function is less efficient because of the nerf to Fenris Wolf and the nerf to Cannonball's own base power. That stuff, I think, is the right direction for nerfs, whereas nerfing Mercury, you very often are having to change the function of the card. So I do think they got this right, but I don't think it's because they know more than us. I think they kind of know the exact same thing that I just said, which is just, it's way easier to nerf the other two, and so that's what they did. Cards shouldn't have more than one effect. Example, Human Torch and the Thing First Steps. I think that if Marvel Snap were a board game, it would be very cool to have this design restriction. Unfortunately, Marvel Snap is a live service game where the idea of the game is that future game pieces will come out and be relevant. And when you want your game pieces to be relevant, you want to have as much design space as you can possibly explore. I think Marvel Snap already suffers a little bit in terms of design space from only having 2 numbers on the card you can reasonably change, which is why I like lines of text that effectively give a 3rd number to the card. When you look at Lady Deathstrike, that is a card that technically has 3 numbers on it. There's her cost, her power, and then also the power that her effect has built into it. And that kind of stuff is, I think, actually quite important for balance in this game. So I think that it would be probably a mistake to, in a live service game where you want to, that already has relatively shallow design space, to even limit that design space even further by saying, hey, you want another number on this card? You can't actually have it unless it's the only other thing on this card. Me personally, I would think that the right way to go about this is to give more of these pseudo numbers like Lady Deathstrike. Part of what I don't like about the Fallen one is that it takes a line of text that could have added a 2nd number to the card, or a 3rd number, I should say, and instead does not add that. It's still all scaling off the power. And I would hope that they learned that lesson from Lady Deathstrike, and maybe it's just a more evocative design if you do the Fallen one the way that they did it. But it is something that sticks out where it's I think that they should make more use of those lines of text to add depth and texture to designs. Because there is not a lot of balance space or design space in this game, and because text still has to be short enough to fit, we saw that with Galactus' first steps, I think they should make the most of the text they have, or the space they have for text. And if that means that they put a second line of text or a second ability on a card, I think that's probably a good thing, because it defines that card as doing something different than what other cards are doing. Marvel Snap is largely a fairly simple game, and a lot of the depth comes from the way game pieces interact with each other. Limiting that artificially, I think, would be bad for the game. Playing a tech slop deck takes no skill. I think this is largely not true of basically anything. Like, there are never going to be metagames where skill is a non-factor no matter what. I think that, especially picking out whatever deck you hate, like, oh, hella decks take no skill. I just don't think that's true, and that's the deck that I hate, right? So when you really boil this down, to me, I think it is just fundamentally misunderstanding what the role of skill in a game defined by the intersection of randomness and skill is. The role of skill is not to win every game. In fact, I think randomness and the worst player winning is actually what keeps these games replayable, because otherwise the better player would win every time. Why would you sign up for that? That learning curve is part of what makes fighting games so insular, I think. And fighting games are super cool, but you have to like lab a ton before you're even able to have a conversation about the game. And that artificially limits how many people can actually start picking the game up. When you have this inbuilt RNG, you have a baseline greater ability for a worse player, a newer player, to beat a more experienced player. By the same token, I think people assume that skill is it's like an RPG where you like invest points into your good at card games stat. And I can tell you that like there is a degree to which good at card games is a skill, but it's also very much based on experience. It is something that comes from work and effort. It is not this inherent ability to think better than other people. It's an understanding of the context of metagames and why things are the way that they are, and building up these muscles in such a way. And I think muscles are a pretty good analogy. There are going to be people who have better genetics than you. That will happen. They will have better genetics for muscle building, a little bit of a mutation, maybe just better muscle insertions so they look better with their shirt off at the same amount of muscle, relatively speaking. All of that can happen, but you won't even get to a position where you can talk about it unless you are putting in the work in the first place. And I think people look at skill as like this ineffable thing. And I guess I just want to say that it's very effable. You can go out there and acquire skill and get better by doing the work. It is not something that is inherent to the people that have a high rank. It is something that you can achieve. And I firmly believe that everyone could be good at whatever they wanted to be good at. I really do believe that. It's a question of, relatively, some people might have to try a little bit less, some people might have to try a little bit more, but the potential is there. And I genuinely do believe that. So the idea that decks have like inherently low skill levels, I think is reliant on like a sort of pyramid of misassumptions about what skill even is. The increased number of cards has been great overall, but it's been especially great for consumers of Snap content. Twitch streams and YouTube videos have been so much more fun since this change. One of the best decisions SD ever made. See, I actually disagree with this, because I think it like logically would track that, oh, there's more things to talk about. That means there's more beneficial streams for me to do. But that's only true if the things are worth talking about. So there's a bunch of cards where it's like, I'm never gonna make a video on Awesome Andy, other than to tell you it probably sucks. And that's not actually a video's worth or a stream's worth of content, right? So it's not just that there are more cards and thus I can talk about them more. There are more cards and some of them are just like basically worth ignoring. And I think that it would be bad content that people wouldn't watch if I tried to make a 15-minute video about Awesome Andy that was just me telling you, this card should probably be a 2/3, because I can do that right now. I can just tell you that right now as part of this video. Like I think there is a baseline level that a card has to get up to before it's actually worth talking about or worth making content on. And I think that if they were to listen to what I'm saying and then go ahead and say every card that they're going to make is going to be at that level, that would also be bad for the game. That's what power creep is. And I think there's kind of a lot to think about in the context of what is a good new card, what is a not good new card. And I think you can draw a very different line from like, okay, Awesome Andy pretty obviously sucks, sure, to a card that like kind of sucks but is at least exciting like Dormammu, right? And I think that there are plenty of cards that are both not exciting and not powerful. And I think that that's sort of the place Awesome Andy falls into. And I think when you look at making Snap content, it is good for aggregate amount of content you can make, but that was never my problem. I can always make content. My problem was not I didn't have enough stuff to talk about. So for me, it does basically nothing. I have tons of stuff to talk about. I get to make videos like this, and for some reason, people watch them. Remember to like and subscribe. The game was way too generous from the start. It creates a paradox that you can get everything easily with the original series drops, which then sets high expectations on any monetization systems afterward, despite them being improvements. Yeah, so there's another part of this that people don't understand and don't talk about, is that the original versions of series drops were planned for when each new card cost like $100 in a gacha. Like, the original, oh, we're going to drop every card after 2 months, was for Nexus events. And it was able to be generous in terms of when cards rotated down because it was so rapacious in terms of initial card monetization. And so what happened when they got rid of Nexus events was they had the generous part of the system still installed. That was the series drops at the current state that they were in. But they had no monetization model at any level of rapaciousness to try to make up for what that is. When you have a very generous back end of your monetization model and no front end, and players join your game seeing only the very generous back end, any front end would end up being reacted to negatively. But it's also, they can't not do that, right? Like, it's impossible for them not to do that. Basically, because of the reaction to series drops, they took out their front end. They took out the part where they were actually making money, and they kept what is effectively the pity system. So you joined a game with no monetization and only a pity system. So they were just only giving you stuff. And that is largely the context in which this stuff should be understood. But it's not, because people don't know about that. They don't know that they got half of the good half of a monetization system and not the bad half, because the bad half was so bad that they had to rework the entire thing. And then they're stuck with this idea of the good half of the monetization system because that's what the players joined and experienced, and that's what they're like anchored to. And now they have to develop a whole new rapacious monetization system for the front end so they can actually make enough money to justify the fact that they're giving you the cards for free in 2 months. And then you have this like repeating cycle of like, what is monetization? Why is it like the way that it is? And fundamentally, I agree with this take, but it's all down to the fact that the original monetization system people signed up for was the good half of a monetization system that had a bad half. They just never saw the bad half because it was so bad, which means by comparison, the good half got to be really good. So they only saw the really good part. Snapping well is more important than having the best deck if you want to climb ranks. Objectively true. There's literally not even a hot take in here. That's just a fact. There's nothing else to say about this. My biggest weakness as a Marvel snapper is the snap point. My biggest strength is the deck building and the ability to like customize and understand what the metagame is about right now and explain that to people. Never been in question. The thing is that snapping is not the kind of thing that I can teach or learn in a YouTube video because it is so contextual and so based on your understanding of your opponent's range and how early you are able to estimate that. So when my content talks about best decks, what I'm doing effectively is trying to raise your floor. My goal is to raise your floor. You shouldn't be at a KMBest. You shouldn't be a KMBest watcher and understand what I'm saying and have a low floor. You should be able to climb. But if you want to climb to the highest ranks, you're going to need to raise your ceiling too. I think that's where snapping really starts to matter a ton. Gambit should banish the card instead of discarding it. You shouldn't be able to destroy one of your opponent's cards and gain something from it. I don't think Gambit is a power outlier. But I do wonder if there's, like, I hadn't really thought about this hot take in this context, because I think a lot of what makes card games cool is that there are decks that take things that are perceived as downsides and turn them into upsides, right? Oh, I have a deck where I have a bunch of cards that blow up my own things, but when I blow up my own things, good things happen for me. Oh, I have a deck where I discard my own things, but when I discard my own things, good things happen for me. And that's like a very classic, it's fun to let players do that. So I don't think there's anything fundamentally imbalanced about the idea of turning an upside into a downside with a card like Gambit. And I do kind of think that Gambit is sort of the perfect top-down design for the character. Like, this is literally a character who throws playing cards at people and blows them up, throwing a playing card at something and blowing it up. It's awesome. It's a really cool, evocative fantasy. I'm not necessarily opposed to the idea of Banish, but I do think it removes the reason you'd want to play Gambit. No one plays Gambit without a plan to turn him into upside. It's not a card that shows up unless you're turning it into upside. So I think largely what this does is make the card more boring and also make it show up less. So if I were to nerf Gambit, I would probably do something other than this. This is not to say that it's like a bad direction to go, because, I mean, we all know what happens when my opponent's Gambit hits the correct thing and I just like instantly lose my mind and like try to dive out of the nearest window, but I'm on the first floor. So really all that happens is I like scuff my nose because I dove head first, but like I'm just scuffing my nose on the ground. That's basically what happens every time a Gambit works out well for my opponent. And every time a Gambit works out well for me, it was all skill that I perfectly calculated and made very smart decisions about. That's important to understand that. But I do want to be clear that I do think that Gambit pops up a lot in these conversations about cards that aren't fun. And I kind of think he might be the most fun card in the game, as much as I hate him. Fun is not symmetrical all of the time. But Gambit always, like, I can't think of a single card that raises my blood pressure the way Gambit does, both good and bad. And I think that maybe you could say he's a bit too far, but I also think card games kind of need cards like that. There needs to be this, like, Hail Mary come from behind win ability in these games. And I think Gambit, is he the greatest version of that? I don't know, but between his design and the fact that he fills that role, I'm a lot more sympathetic to Gambit than I think most people would expect. I think Galactus is actually in a really healthy spot despite being annoying, because aside from Wave, you can only really get him out on turn 5, and to get more power there early, it requires telegraphing and priority management. I agree, actually, that current Galactus is kind of in a great spot. Like, this is a card that is not necessarily mostly bad, but it's bad enough that it's kind of a meme deck that you can still lose to, and that's exactly where you want a card like Galactus. And there are kind of a lot of cards like that. The problems with cards like Galactus, I think Galactus himself gets kind of a bad rap from his old text, which was very stupid. To me, the biggest problem with cards like Galactus, old Galactus, I should say, was when they were good, they would effectively make the game about, did you have it? And that's always been an issue, right? I feel that way about Galactus. I feel that way about current Hela, where it's just like, oh, did you have the Stardust? Okay, guess I lose. You didn't have the Stardust? Okay, guess I win. Like, there's a lot of turn 6 invalidation of the prior 5 turns, where because of the way, to me, a lot of the fun of Marvel Snap is the final turn. I am deploying my points here. My opponent is deploying their points here. Have I properly estimated their range? And basically none of that happens with decks like Galactus and Hela, and to a lesser degree Mr. Negative, but it's okay for them to be mid decks. It's okay for that to exist. And I think that largely Galactus is in the spot that I would want all of those decks to be in. Where, like, when it happens to you, you're like, damn, that sucked, but at least I don't have to play against it like 20 more times today. And I think I agree with this take. This is where decks like Hela should be. Sort of sub-meta level, but still can win and beat you a decent amount of the time. Mr. Negative is the strongest deck and flies under the radar in both Conquest and Ranked season after season. One of the only archetypes to never be nerfed once. Okay, so there's an inherent contradiction here, which is, if it's so damn strong, why is it never getting nerfed? Because the people who have actual data are the people who do the nerfs, and the people who have half data are people like us with Untapped and SnapFan and MSZ. So I think largely, I'm going to err on the side of if it was busted, they'd probably be nerfing it. But there's another thing I wanted to talk about here, and it's the use of statistics as an entire argument. Because I think that there are a bunch of different confounding factors that make pointing at really any statistic about Marvel Snap a little bit fraught, that are very rarely actually considered by the people who are simply posting them on Twitter. And I think this is a good example of it, because I think it's very easy for you to look at this and say, oh, what it says is Mr. Negative is the best deck. Oh, okay, so Mr. Negative is the best deck. And what it's actually saying is, within our sample size, within our cohort of people that report to Untapped, we'll more on this one later, and within whatever parameters you decide to put on it, Mr. Negative has performed the best of these decks at this play rate. And it's a much more, I guess I would say it's a much more nuanced conversation. So like when you look at something like Untapped, there are a couple of major issues that should stick out to you. And this is true of basically any data site that is opt-in. When you have opt-in data, the people that are opting in are largely people who are better than the people who are not opting in, because they are try hard enough to opt into a data site to get an insight on what to play. They are try hard enough to care about that kind of stuff. And so that obviously biases the data in some ways as well. But there's some other stuff going on here that I wanted to address too, which is there's this constant idea that Conquest and Ladder are two functionally different metagames. And to the degree that they are, it is because Conquest has it is mostly because Conquest has no matchmaking in Infinite Conquest. This leads to people playing Infinite Conquest and beating up on people who are new to the game or don't have an equivalent collection level, etc., etc. Because Infinite Conquest has no MMR matchmaking or collection level matchmaking, you're just matching against whoever. You, the person who is try hard enough to be reporting to Untapped, is going to have a relatively higher win rate just by virtue of having some extra free wins in the pool that would not exist if you were actually getting matched fairly. This is incidentally also true of data that is under the infinite rank, and we'll get to top to bottom 50% infinite in a bit, but there's issues there too. My climb from 70 to 100 is not the same as your climb from 70 to 100. And this has been something that a lot of people have explored. But it also bears explanation because what's happening is there's an internal MMR. And basically everyone who finished at a decent rank in Infinite is getting reset to whatever MMR you want to call it. Let's call it 8,500, about there. Meanwhile, let's say you finished, I don't know, the middle of Infinite. You're probably at like 7,000 or 6,500 SP. And you get reset to about 7,000 or 6,500 SP. If we are both at rank 83, it will never match us because I am such a higher MMR that it thinks that it is an unfair match to give you, probably correctly. That means that when you look at data from 70 to 99, you are effectively looking at what is not an actual group of people. It is not an actual ranked cohort. You're looking at a bunch of individualized climbs. And the same thing is happening, to tie this back, to Conquest data. When you look at Conquest data, what you're seeing is the cohort of people who report to Untapped versus the cohort of people who don't report to Untapped. So you'll see a lot of Infinite Conquest where basically every deck is a really high win rate, because that's what happens when you have a bunch of people who are trying really hard who are playing against a bunch of people who aren't trying really hard. I'm not sure I'm explaining this correctly. I hope you're getting the gist. But largely, when it comes to my personal use, I don't look at any data on Untapped that is outside 10% Infinite. And even that has its own issues when you think about what top 10% is and like, would I listen to this person normally? Like, there's a lot to understand about the use of data. Largely what I'm getting at here, though, is there are so many confounding factors that any person who posts a screenshot of a tier list on Untapped or MSZ or any of that and says, this is proof that what I'm saying is correct, you should not listen to that person. And I think the same actually applies. If someone says, KMBest said so, you should not listen to that person, because I might be able to explain why I think the way that I think, but someone who is just getting this secondhand probably doesn't understand all the nuances of it. So I want to be clear about that. It's not like, oh, I think this is bad because I'm pushing a competing product. My product is actually explicitly not competing with data sites, I think, because it's very much more about my opinions. These are my takes on what these things are, and I hope I've been very clear about that. But you see this a lot, not necessarily misuse of data, but data presented as objective reality when it's not that. And in so doing, I don't think people are lying, right? But like, okay, here's an example. Regis Kilbin found that Ultron deck on Untapped, and he was like, this is the #1 deck post-infinite, right? And if you checked, it was the #1 deck post-infinite at when you looked at 100+ win rate, you could see it was right there. And then if you sorted by top 10% infinite, it had like a 46% win rate. And there's a bunch of explanations for that, but that doesn't mean it's wrong for him to call it the #1 deck, because by the criteria he was using, it is. But it would mean that it would be wrong for me, someone who focuses on top 10% infinite, to call it a good deck, when it clearly is not in a cohort of people who actually know how the game works. And I think that like this kind of stuff, it's like when you look at data, what do you get out of it? How does it apply to you? You need to be really careful about making these sort of sweeping pronouncements based on it. Anyway, kind of got off track of the hot take. This is just something I've been sitting on for a while. I hope you sat through it. Thank you so much. Thanks for watching, y'all. As always, I've been KMBest. You've been phenomenal, and I will see you in the next one.